Hey, what's up, students? Thanks for being part of Life Group today. Before we jump right in, I want to kind of remind you guys of an opportunity we have. Hey, this last Thursday, our group that met, that's reading through the Bible, we had an opportunity to Zoom and encourage one another. And I know there were some that weren't able to be a part of it, and that's cool. I also know that there's maybe some of you guys that as you're watching this and you're thinking, man, I kind of wish I'd been a part of that. It's not too late. Listen, I'm not going to be upset. Nobody in the group is going to be upset if you jump in next week or you jump in even a couple weeks from now. I'd rather you jump in and be a part of it midstream than not be a part of it at all. So here's, again, a reminder of what we're doing. If you want to be a part of a Bible reading plan that's going to take us the rest of the year, but we're going to read the bulk of the entire Bible. Each week there's 5 days of reading and 2 scripture verses that you have an opportunity to memorize. And so that's your 7 days. Obviously, it doesn't take a ton of time every day. It's like 2, maybe 3 chapters a day. That does not take a ton of your time. And so I would encourage you to be a part of it. If you want more information about it, certainly let your life group leader know. You can text me. You can reach out on our social media and just say, like, hey, I want to be part of the group. But the other part of it, it's not just reading. It's not just scripture memory, but it is that Zoom group where we can gather together and talk about what we read. And because there's going to be parts of the Bible that we'll read and, you might be like, I've never read that before. And there might be parts that you read or I read and we're like, man, I really needed to hear that this week. And so we're going to have a chance for those that are in that group to kind of walk through like, hey, this was something that really stuck out and was powerful for me this week. And in you sharing that, it's going to be a way of you teaching and encouraging and challenging everybody else in that group. And so no matter if you're an adult, if you're a student, it's going to be an amazing time. And so, again, more information on that, ask your life group leaders, text me, reach out on our social media, and I'd love for you to be a part of it. Hey, so we're going to jump back into our conversation. The past 2 weeks, we've been talking about goals. Yes, it's January. Yes, it is kind of that time of year where people think about resolutions or, hey, I want to do something a little different, or I want to improve this, or I want to get better in this. I want to have some goals and dreams that I realized this year. And so it's an appropriate time for us to talk about this, but it's not just goal setting. It's also really kind of looking at what has God called you to do, and more importantly, who has God called you to be? And so a couple weeks ago, we kind of asked that question. And one of the things I mentioned was think about who you want to be and think about the impact or the impact that you have or what you want to do. Think about that for your life 5, 10, maybe 15 years down the road. And then kind of walk that back and say, okay, if that's kind of where you want to be, then what do you need to be doing now? But also, let's not forget that there's still today to live. And so, who has God called you to be right now? What are some of the dreams and the plans that God has laid out for you right now as a middle school student, as a high school student, as a life group leader, as an adult, as somebody who's going to be an adult in a couple of years, somebody who's going to be in college this time next year, that kind of thing. So goals, dreams. We've been talking that there are some God-sized dreams that I believe God has for each and every single one of us, and they're huge. And it's maybe more than we can certainly tackle on our own, but that doesn't mean that they're not worth following. And so we've been looking at that concept, that idea of goals and God-sized dreams, as we've been looking at the book of Nehemiah and looking at the story of Nehemiah. And so just to kind of catch up, Nehemiah is... in the Old Testament, Nehemiah was a guy who grew up and lived in Jerusalem before it was taken over by the Babylonians and King Artaxerxes. Nehemiah was part of the group of people that were taken from Jerusalem and moved to Babylon, modern-day Iraq, that general vicinity. And he started actually working for the king. He was a cupbearer, which meant his job was to taste any drink before the king did, in case it was poisoned. Kind of a security measure for the king and an important role for Nehemiah. Means he had a pretty decent relationship with the king. The king knew him, and he had an opportunity to have conversations with the king that most people, maybe like Nehemiah, would have never had. And so in Nehemiah chapter 1, we learn that Nehemiah finds out that Jerusalem, because it's been overtaken, its walls are torn down, its gates are burned, and as a city, it's not protected. Physically, it's not protected. The walls were a protective measure for the city itself, but it also was a picture, because it was just left in ruins. It's also a spiritual picture of the people of the city. And those two things bothered Nehemiah. In fact, it bothered him so much that it took an emotional toll on him that he spent months praying and fasting and asking God to do something and asking God to use him to do something. So a few months later, and again, last week we looked that from the time that Nehemiah learned this to the time that Nehemiah had a conversation with King Artaxerxes, it was about 88 days at the least between those two moments. So Nehemiah spent some time praying. It wasn't just like, God, you got to do something. And then just kind of that, he hung it up. He's like, wow, man, I've prayed about it. No, Nehemiah had prayed about it. Nehemiah had absorbed it, digested it, prayed about it, fasted to give more time to prayer and focus on the Lord. Nehemiah had really wrestled with this great trouble, the news that his city, his hometown, his land, his people were in disarray. And so in chapter 2 of Nehemiah, the king and Nehemiah have a conversation, and the king notices that Nehemiah is sad. And notice that it's not because he is sick, it's that his heart hurts, his heart is heavy. And so the king says, what's up, Nehemiah? Why are you sad? What's wrong? And so Nehemiah tells him. He tells him what's going on in the city of Jerusalem. He tells him why that bothers him. And then he tells him, I would love to go back and I would love to fix the walls for my city, which is kind of a bold ask. That's saying, King, I want to quit my job. I want to quit working for you, and I want to go take care of something back home. And the king actually allowed it to happen. He sent some resources so that Nehemiah could get on his way. And the other thing that we looked at last week is that Nehemiah did run into a little bit of opposition. We talked about how Nehemiah had a plan. He wasn't just like a dream. It wasn't a wish, because wish, it's kind of like, I got a wish that, this would happen. Well, you're waiting on the fairy godmother to show up for that one. But a dream, a goal, has a plan attached. And so not only did Nehemiah spend time praying, but he spent some time thinking through, okay, how would I actually make this happen if God gave me the opportunity to do it? And so Nehemiah had a plan that he shared with the king, and he shared with a couple people that went with him. But he also knew that he was going to face opposition. He knew that this wasn't going to run cleanly. And so we saw a little bit of that at the beginning of chapter 2, where people were like, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? I don't get it. I don't buy it. You shouldn't even be doing that. And Nehemiah, we talked about last week, he knew who not to listen to, and he knew who to listen to. He knew that he needed some people in his corner to encourage him, and he knew that there were going to be naysayers. He knew that there were people that were just going to never understand, never be on board, and he knew where he should listen the most. And so that's kind of where we left off, and today we're going to kind of pick right back up in the story in Nehemiah. And so as we do that in Nehemiah chapter 3, we could go through it. We could spend a lot of time reading all the names and all the people that were involved. But really the point of Nehemiah chapter 3, it's really an interesting chapter, because it shows us that the vision, the dream that God had given Nehemiah, that Nehemiah was bold enough to take on, it started to capture the hearts and minds of a bunch of other people. That it wasn't just Nehemiah doing this by himself and working harder than anybody else. There were a lot of other people that jumped in, and some of that is because Nehemiah knew he couldn't do it alone. He knew he had to enlist a bunch of other people, and then that also motivated people. They cared about it too, but maybe they didn't care enough to do anything about it. But when they saw something happening, they were like, "Let's get in. Let's go." And so chapter 3 shows us all the people that were kind of stepping in, and it shows us maybe a little bit that there's still some opposition, but it's an encouraging chapter in that regard, that Nehemiah wasn't alone. But as we get to chapter 4, we run into some more of this opposition, and that's kind of where we're going to hang out today, of dealing with that opposition, dealing with the people that are almost going to actively work against you. And so Nehemiah chapter 4, we run across a couple other people that we saw in chapter 2. So Nehemiah chapter 4, starting in verse 1, it says, "Now when Sanballat heard that they were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he mocked the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers in the army of Samaria, 'What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that?' Verse 3, then Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him and said, 'Yes, what are they building? If a fox goes up on it, will he break down their stone wall?' Now, if you read that, you're like, it's kind of weird. This is like old school smack talk. See, Sanballat and Tobiah, they were part of the guys in chapter 2 that were like, what are you even doing? We shouldn't even let you go. And yet they still saw what was happening. And Sanballat was like, the cute little rocks that were broken down, are you going to pull the big rocks out of that? Are you going to make those little small rocks into big rocks? And then, Tobiah Tobiah, who's like, hey man, a fox is going to break your wall. You're not even a good builder, that kind of stuff. So it's like old school smack talk and throwing shade at Nehemiah. They were not just confused and not understanding what Nehemiah was doing. They were actively opposing Nehemiah. And if we continue reading in verse 4, we're going to see Nehemiah's response. And so again, this should remind us, hey, look, there's going to be people, especially if you start following the Lord, if you start saying, God, I'm open, I want to be who you've called me to be, and I want to do what you've called me to do. There's going to be some people that don't understand. There's going to be some people that might say, hey man, I don't get it. You do you, that's cool. And then there's going to be probably a group of people that might even actively go against you and oppose you and try to derail you. And let's see how Nehemiah responds. So in verse 4, here's what Nehemiah said. Hear, O our God, for we're despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they're captives. Do not cover their guilt. Let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they've provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. Verse 6. So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. So here's what happened. You had people that were making fun and actively opposing Nehemiah and the rest of the people. Nehemiah took it to the Lord, said, I could, if we're like Nehemiah, he might have wanted to respond to those people, but instead he took that and he prayed. He said, God, you've given us a job to do. Now, don't forget their attitude, don't forget their position on this, but we're going to continue. And then in verse 6 it said, and he kept building the wall, and the people with him. And they joined the walls together, which meant you had a bunch of people working different sections. And they joined the wall together, and it was half of its height, half of its original height. And so the people were getting stuff done. And so as you and I think about following the Lord, yes, there's going to be opposition. But you know what? This week in January, kind of that middle of the month, that's when most people give up on their resolution because maybe they're tired, or going to the gym is not fun anymore and their muscles ache a little bit, or they miss having ice cream for dessert, or they miss having coffee, or they miss sleeping in. Because at some point, the newness of that new discipline or that new resolution, that newness is going to wear off, and it maybe isn't going to be fun anymore, but it's still good for them. There's going to be opposition, but that doesn't change the importance of the goal, or the importance of doing what God has called them to do, whether it's fun or not, whether it's easy or not. It doesn't change the fact that Nehemiah was going to be obedient. If we had time to look at the rest of chapter 4 in Nehemiah, we would see that Nehemiah knew that opposition was going to continue to stay there, that he knew that they had to have a plan. They needed to stick together, but they also needed to continue to do the work that God had set them to do. And so one thing that they did is they organized in shifts. They organized to protect one another. So while some were building the wall, there were some that were ready to defend those that were building the wall. They had swords, they had spears. And then it even also tells us that those that were building the wall, like actively building the wall, they also had a sword on their hip. And it wasn't because they were looking for a fight, but they were ready to defend the work that God had called them to do. They were ready to defend what they were doing. They weren't going to go down lightly. And so for you and for me, as we think about our goals and our dreams, just because opposition shows up at our door, just because it gets difficult, and just because we realize this is hard, I don't know if I want to do this anymore, just because that moment may come, that doesn't mean it's time to quit on the goal. That doesn't mean it's time to quit on becoming who God has called us to be. It means it's time to lean into the people that are with us, that are encouraging us, that are challenging us. That's a huge part of even Life Group. That's a huge part for those of us that are doing the Bible reading. That's a huge part of the Zoom call. Because for the first couple weeks, or maybe the first month or two, it might be fun and awesome. But then, man, your schedule may change. And you may have a whole lot more homework. You may have a lot more things going on. And it's just harder to do. And it's going to be easier to give up. But when you've got people that are saying, hey, you can't give up. You got to stay in. You got this. You got this. We're in this together. I'll build this section. You build this section. People are going to be, they got your back. They're watching your six. You keep doing your thing. We got you. We got to do this. Then it becomes easier. And you realize if you stop, and in Nehemiah's case, if people were to quit, then that whole wall is going to have gaps. that there's going to be sections of the walls that don't get built. So they're not only going to be letting themselves down, they're going to be letting the other people down. So it's easier to keep going when you've got a group of people that are there with you. And so as we think about continuing and God giving us strength to pursue the goals and the dreams that He set before us, we know it's going to take that community of people around us, that we can't do it by ourselves or on our own. And so I want to stop here, and I want to kind of turn you over to that community that's going to be part of encouraging you and supporting you, and it's going to be part of you supporting them. And so that's a beautiful kind of relationship that it happens in these life groups. So, hey, love you guys. Keep talking about Nehemiah, and we'll see you next week.